So I'm Haley Peckham, and in almost a beautiful demonstration of unstable self-image, I am someone who has very briefly had the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, very briefly. I might tell you that story. I do very much identify with some of the criteria, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I'm also a neuroscientist, like a die-hard neuroscientist, and I'm a mental health nurse, and I'm a psychotherapist, and a lover of cats. So I do all of those things. All of those things are me. I'm not just one of those things, I'm lots of those things. And that's sort of where I'm coming from here, is this idea of just being seen one way can really pigeonhole us. And I'm sure that's true for you as clinicians as well. Like, who's had a bit of pushback as a psychiatrist? Like, I don't like psychiatrists. Anyone had that? You had that, Sathya? Yeah. Right? Psychologists too, right? Like, we all get it when we're pigeonholed. So that's me introducing myself. I'm all sorts of things. Now, I'm just going to point out, this is how you spell my name, only because if you try and contact me with a Y in, it won't get to me. It'll get to somebody who's in Calgary, who organises rodeos. I get some of her mail. It says, "Can you bring a saddle?" I'm not always this funny. Okay, so this talk's in a few parts. There's a part about me, there's a part about the diagnosis, and there's a part about another way to look at the phenomena. All right? And it ends with an invitation, really, because I haven't got time to take you to all of the places that I'd like to show you, so it ends with an invitation to kind of discover for yourselves. And if I've got time, I'll also fit in a little bit of a rap. I won't be doing the rap. All right. All right, so I started out with about 86 billion neurons. Now, that's not a brag right there. Most of us started out with about 86 billion neurons. And now I know as an adult that the job of those 86 billion neurons is to absolutely absorb my environment, to take in every experience I have, and then so that I can then anticipate my environment. And anticipating my environment is what, of course, helps me survive and thrive within it. But I didn't know that then, right? Look, you can see how hard I'm concentrating on my feet, learning how to ride my tricycle. I remember that T-shirt well. Now, one of the tasks, of course, as a very young infant and a young child is to attach. And attachment, as we all know, is John Bowlby, and it was this idea of retaining proximity to someone bigger than you, who knows the environment better than you, who cares about your survival. Okay, that freaked me out. Sorry, the noise. Attachment. It's to maintain proximity to that caregiver. And we all adapt a little bit to maintain proximity to our caregivers, and some of us have to adapt a little bit more than others. Now, I think that me and my caregiver, and it's my mum, were really quite stuck with some things that we'd both inherited, really. And I don't necessarily mean that in the genetic sense. I just mean this transgenerational trauma. We talk a lot about transgenerational trauma. I think we might also talk about transgenerational shame, and I think that was sort of there. So sometimes she'd look at me like I was some kind of monster, and I wasn't sure about that. And sometimes she looked to me like she was a monster. And I want to get away from this idea of blaming. This isn't about blame at all. What I'm wanting to do is describe what it was like for both of us in this relationship, I think, looking back. I think we were in a kind of claustrophobic, airless vortex. I think we were both doing our best, and we kept missing each other. And we tried harder and harder and faster, and basically it sucked us in. And what happened was that shame pervaded our relationship. I don't want to attach blame to that. As I say, I think it was something that we both struggled with. But what I think happened for me was something that looked a bit like this. So this is actually, I Googled the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," and what do you know? Someone's actually made a map of that, all right? And what struck me about this map was that it looks like a brain network. So it looks like all of those connections adding up. But for me, all those roads didn't lead to Rome. For me, all of those roads led to shame. And that was how I grew up. I was organised by shame. I wouldn't have been able to tell you that, but I think that that was what it was, organised by shame. And then as an adult, I came across this thing. It's called borderline personality disorder. It sort of manifests as instability in relationships and instability in self-image and emotions and impulsivity. If we look a bit more closely at it, it's these attempts to avoid abandonment, this idea of idealization and devaluation, that kind of I love you and then I hate you and then I love you and then I hate you. And unstable self-image, I love me and then I hate me and then I love me and then I hate me again. Impulsivity, as it says. What is it? Reckless spending, sex. You could also include maybe career, maybe changing country, those kinds of things. Speaking for myself, of course. This idea of suicidal behaviour and self-harm. Well, self-harm is something that pervaded my experience. Not so much now. Well, not now, but it definitely used to. And of course that comes from this emotional instability, and there's a kind of a fullness to this, I think, a fullness here, fullness of emotion, full, which contrasts, of course, down here with this chronic emptiness, so this kind of this extreme move from fullness to emptiness. I'm not so keen on this word inappropriate, but anger, yes. Anger, I think, or at least my anger, my rage, it travels in time. So it might not be appropriate to exactly what's happening now, but it was definitely appropriate to something that happened at some point. So just trying to understand a little bit more about what we might mean by that inappropriate word. And paranoid and dissociated. Well, you know, sometimes they are out to get you. Like, don't underestimate it. Sometimes they are. There are people out there, sometimes they are out to get you. And if you've had prior experience of that, you might come to anticipate it. Anyway, the long and the short of it is those are their criteria, and I identify with a lot of them. And I could see this in various manifestations of the way that I express myself. So I'm not going to read this poem. There's no need for me to do that. It's about self-harm. But what I really want to draw attention to here, this self-harm was about needing touch. It's the last line of every verse. Needing touch, needing warmth, needing holding together, needing validation, and needing soothing. Does anyone in here not need those things? Everyone in here needs those things? Okay, the way that I knew how to get those things, the most reliable way I could get those things was by doing this act to myself. That speaks to something about my environment and speaks to something about the way I made sense of it and speaks to something about my survival and resilience in order to get those things that I needed. And then this piece of art here, I'm not an artist, but every now and again I put something down and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that works for what I feel. And this one is about dissociation. And you can see this is me here. I'm like this little sort of drowning in fog figure. And these are the alive things in me, but they're out of my reach. They're too far away. I can't touch them. And they've got this almost characteristic of like veins, like the blood, the life in me is beyond my reach at some point. And this, I suppose, speaks to this idea of emptiness. But when, of course, I'm in contact with these emotions, then it can make me very unstable because they're so big, they're so sort of intense. And then going back to this relationship I had, well, we've got this idea about relationships of being idealized and devalued. And I think that this was the horrible swap that kept happening between me and my mum. I wasn't quite right for her somehow, and she wasn't quite right for me somehow, and we couldn't quite meet. And that's a tragedy, and not something that anyone needs to be blamed for. But you can see from that, if that's my early patterning, then how likely is it that I'm going to anticipate more of that later? That I'm going to anticipate that someone who I care about is suddenly going to turn on me? Why wouldn't I anticipate that? So you can see how this instability might travel in time as an anticipation into the future. And here, I really like this image of, this is oil and water, right? So they're immiscible, but they can be stirred up in ways that get very messy. So they are fundamentally separate things, but they can become messy. And so what I'm speaking to there is this idea of enmeshment, where myself get so tangled up with the person who I'm trying to be the right thing for that I don't know where I stop and where they begin. So I have to learn this whole idea of how to connect safely all over again. I've got a picture of an oil boom, and I think my first experience of psychotherapy was like having an oil boom where I could kind of, as maybe the oil, come up against the oil boom and not harm the water that was on the other side. I learnt to sort of safely connect. I learnt where the edges were. Compassionately, I learnt where the edges were. And this is one of my shortest poems ever. I will read it because it's short. Torn between wanting to be what you want, so you want me, and not wanting to know what you want, so I can be me. I hope that shows you something of how important to not be abandoned it was for me to be the right thing. If I'm the right thing, I won't get left. I was in foster care for a while, and it didn't work very well. I was a very good kid, and the ironic story I tell is that I'm the only kid I know that got kicked out of foster care for being too good. It's funny, but it's sad, and it's because I did all the things that a good kid would do. I did all the housework, and I did the dishes, and I did all of that stuff. And of course, think with your emotional minds, what was that like for the only child that was in the family before, who was quite a normal teenager, who sulked in a room and, didn't really want to help much around the house, but was very secure with her parents. So I come in as the cuckoo child. I do all this stuff that's good. I make her feel pushed out, and what happens? I'm the one that has to leave. You can see, again, the tragedy there. You can see how it would happen. So trying to be what someone wants doesn't work. So if I can hold that out of the way, if I don't care too much, then I can get on with being me. But of course, that just then, we've got this then shift, haven't we, of trying to be something and then wanting to just be me, and then trying to be something and then wanting to just be me. And you can see how this sort of movement between extremes can be fast and can be desperate at times. And this image here, I don't know if you can see, but there's this tiny shadowy image here, right? And that tiny shadowy image, in this moment in time, this shadowy image is the part of me that hopes. And there's another part of me which is raging and contemptuous at this part of me. Why don't you stop hoping? It's not for you. You're not lovable. Why do you have to keep doing this over and over again? Why do you set yourself up for such disappointment? And you can hear in my tone that kind of violence, and that image is what's behind my self-harm when I self-harm. I don't do that so much anymore, so I'm okay sort of talking about it. It's just 2009. This aspect of me that hates the part of me that hopes because it can get so terribly, terribly hurt. But I can't live like that. I have to kind of gather myself together and hope again, but maybe hope more cautiously. But I'm not very good at doing it cautiously. I'm a bit of an all-in person. And so you then see, again, this emptiness, self-harm, impulsivity. You can see how it sort of plays, how it all plays out. I came across some work by a woman called Martha Stark. Is anyone familiar with Martha Stark's work? Yeah, lovely. So Martha Stark talks about hope being a defense, and I only came across it quite recently, and it absolutely sort of punched me in the guts when I read it, because I really recognized it. I cling on to hope in a very desperate way, and in a very almost like with a religious fervor, I can be hopeful at times. And that, I think, is the thing that also sets me up for these big falls. So now I'm engaging with this idea that hope sometimes in me can be a defense. And of course, what she says about that is that I need to do more grieving. I'm like, okay. And lastly, on this tour of my words and pictures, I do want to read this one because it's important. This one's called Ghostly Me. I remember the intensity, her eyes crazed with rage, fixing mine, the wideness, redness, depth of her mouth and throat and fury consuming me, the flecks of spit, her venom that I was too paralyzed to wipe away, her relentless onslaught when I was her victim. But sometimes her laughter, if I amused her, her confidences as if I was her mentor, her entreaties when I withheld from her, her tears when I was her comforter, her madness and pain. I was her tormentor, her grief, her despair, her rescuer, and her witness. But most of all, I remember her absence. In the dread and the anticipation, the sucking, blinding silence, the coldness, the deadness, the frozen house and life, my ghostly limbs that failed to connect, the hollowness and transparency of me. I was nothing when she wasn't there. And that, I think, speaks to the desperation that we had to be something for each other. So much so that when she wasn't there, I would stand in a room not knowing quite what to do. So going back to this idea of being under the spotlight, the way you see me becomes who I am. The way you see me can become an identity that I might step into. We need to be very careful about how we see people, because they might live up to that or live into that. And so maybe that's what I want you to take with you, is knowing or carrying that responsibility, not heavily, but with a willingness to be open-minded when you're looking. And that's easier said than done. I hope this computer networked to the internet? Shh. It is. All right. Has anyone seen Einstein's hollow mask illusion before? Well, let's see if this works. No, it does not. Okay, I'm going to describe it. It's not going to work, but I'll describe it. So Einstein's hollow mask. So David Eagleman is my favorite neuroscientist. You should all have a favorite neuroscientist. I'm an option. David Eagleman's an option. So David Eagleman does this. He has this series. It's called like What is the Brain, or something like that. It's called different things in different countries. In the show that's called What is Reality, what he does is he takes us on a little tour of Seattle. He walks around Seattle. And he says, our brains don't, it's not that our visual system sees whatever it is that's out there. What it does is it compares what's out there to what we already know. And if there's a difference, it takes notice of it. So that means, and he talks about the brain, and he says, 6/7 of the traffic in the brain when we are having a perceptual experience comes from the back. It's interesting, isn't it? Because our eyes are at the front. Only 1/7 of our perceptual experience comes in through our eyes. And what that speaks to is the amount of anticipation that goes into the experience of seeing. And the way he demonstrates this is he walks up to a hollow mask of Einstein, which is rotating on a single pivot. And what happens, and would have happened here if I managed to get it to work, is that as the mask turns and you're seeing this kind of concave image, your brain cannot hang on to the concave image. And so it plays a little trick on you and it says, no, the face is sticking out. It's because your brain has only ever had experiences of sticky out faces. It doesn't know what a sticky in face looks like. So it superimposes the direction of travel and the shadows. It says, never mind all that information, this is still a face, okay? Which speaks again to this, the power of anticipation. Now, I've shown that loads of times, not successfully today, but usually it does work. And it doesn't matter how many times I watch it, I cannot hang on with my mind and my perception to that concave image. It always sort of superimposes the other. So that's why I sort of bring this sort of challenge. If we start with a premise of illness, we will see illness, okay? So what I invite you to do, as hard as it is, because we are very entrenched in an idea of illness, is to try and let go of that and just to think, actually, what is the phenomena I'm seeing? What do we see? What could it mean? How could it make sense? Is a good question. And the other good question is, and what might be needed? And that's the framework of adaptation, which is how I have approached the struggles I have, one way or another. The other hat that I should have told you about is I'm quite a stubborn individual. And I didn't want to go and see a psychiatrist because I had a fairly strong anticipation of what would happen. And no offense to anyone in the room, but I think it was one of my better decisions. In that, out of that kind of crucible of desperation, And knowing what that option might go to, I wanted to understand it differently. So those 86 billion neurons that I had learnt my world and did the very best they could with what I had. And it's turned out, all right, livable most days. But to start unpacking some of our assumptions, let's begin with these guys. These trees grow on, they're the slope point trees. They grow on right on the coast in New Zealand. So they're exposed to winds that travel at like 2,000 miles an hour, 2,000 kilometers an hour. Does anyone think these genes have a genetic vulnerability for wind? You can laugh. They probably, thank you, Kate. So it seems very clear to me that these trees are growing in a very, very windy place. So we don't think of there being a kind of genetic vulnerability in these trees. We just look to the environment. And that's what trees do, right? Trees show us something about the environment because they reflect it in some way. Human beings are harder because they move around and they get older and they change countries and they do exciting things and they have new experiences. So you can't just look at someone and see what their experiences were in the past in the same way that you can trees. So we have to use our imagination. But just to kind of open up some of our ideas about how we understand genes, there's this thing called genotype, and that's one thing, but there's this thing called phenotype, and that's another. And phenotype, or the difference between genotype and phenotype, is the impact of the way that the environment realizes those genes, makes those genes real, brings those genes to life, as it were. So we can see very great differences in phenotype. So what we call vulnerability genes could also be called plasticity genes, because a particular, say there's a gene that makes us more neuroplastic, for example, neuroplasticity being a fantastic thing. If there's a gene that makes us more neuroplastic and it arrives in an environment which is maybe very, very chaotic or very dangerous, the way of surviving a chaotic and dangerous environment is to have rigid safety routines. So that plasticity gene it's not really going to be that exercised there. But if that plasticity gene goes into a different kind of environment where learning or being open to something might give some kind of advantage, then that phenotype will be very different in that environment. So same genotype, different outcomes. It's a very, very great paper, that one by Belsky. I totally encourage you to read up some of his papers. Here we go. The results considered suggest that putative vulnerability genes or risk alleles might at times be more appropriately conceptualized as plasticity genes because they seem to make individuals more susceptible to environmental influences for better and worse. So what I did over many years, really, and it would have started in childhood, really, the real seeds for this, is I came up with this it's a theory, it's a framework, I suppose. The neuroplastic narrative, it's alliteratively named sort of to compare to the medical model. So medical model, neuroplastic narrative, slightly different ways of approaching things. And this is a biological framework that privileges experience. It talks about how we adapt to our experiences and the neuroplastic mechanisms that are responsible for embedding our experiences into our physiology. It talks about the experiences we adapt to. These very early attachment experiences being a prime example of the first and most important adaptation we have to make. And lastly, and really fascinating, is this evolutionary perspective that I also invite in, which is about why we adapt in the ways that we do. Now, many of you will have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, but if you run that through an evolutionary framework, what you find, and there's a number of papers written about this, I've written one, but I can't remember his name. Never mind, it'll come. When we look at the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, one of the stats that's hardly ever spoken about is the increase in mating behavior, reproductive effort. They noticed that more than 4 categories of adversity in childhood led to the higher risk of people having more than 50 sexual partners and contracting a sexually transmitted disease. What we notice when we look at these results broadly is that reproduction is spared at the expense of health. And that's an evolutionary model. This is to do with how we adapt to very harsh and unpredictable circumstances where planning is not possible. So I don't want to get us off track because I won't have much time to talk about this, but this idea of living fast has some perks from an evolutionary perspective, okay? So it has some sense attached to it. So just to speak a little about neuroplasticity, I think about raindrops and how they shape the landscape of our brains and bodies. Many of you have seen this slide before. I'm sure if you've seen me speak, it's sort of my trademark slide. I think of experiences as being a little bit like raindrops. So each raindrop doesn't make a particular difference, but together lots and lots of raindrops really do. And the only exception to that is if you've had an experience which is profound, like a really traumatic experience that has been terrifying or you've thought might kill you. That would have a bigger impact, for example. But mostly, experiences are like minutiae, just like rain is, just like drizzle is. They fall on the brain, they create pathways, and just like rain, it travels down the path of least resistance, just like we expect. And it creates channels so that the next time there's rainfall and the next time there's experiences, they're likely to go down the channels that are already there. And so then that brings up these sort of rivers of experience, rivers of water. And ultimately, we know that it is water that shapes the entire landscape. So really, I would say it's more correct to think of experiences as building brains, not just shaping them. So the mechanisms, and I'm not going to talk in any detail about these, I'm just going to name them, are epigenetics, neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity, and white matter plasticity. These are all mechanisms of neuroplasticity. It behooves us to be impacted by our environment, otherwise we wouldn't have evolved all of these mechanisms that adapt us to our environment in the way that we do. And this isn't an exhaustive list, there are many more mechanisms that do this. But ultimately what that then means is that the same neuroplastic mechanisms, which we will have genes for, build different brains from different experiences that are shaped to survive in different environments. So perhaps if we've had an environment, an ecology, a kind of family and community ecology, a relational ecology that is benevolent or at least benign and predictable, then that's likely to lead us to have a brain that can plan. It can make these future opportunities. It can look out for future opportunities. It has time to build this part of the brain that's about executive function. And it's not so preoccupied with immediate threats because it hasn't had so many experiences of them. It's not so necessary to anticipate them. But a brain that's specialized for a very harsh and unpredictable environment might be realized, made real by the environment in a very different way. So this brain, having had so many experiences of harshness or unpredictability, is absolutely geared to look at immediate threat. Why wouldn't it be? That's the best way to survive, right? Be on the lookout. Think it's a snake rather than a stick. Take evasive action. Don't wait around to see if it is one or not, because that would kill you. So you're much better served by being impulsive in these kinds of environments. Very much more preoccupied with survival. And these ideas of planning, well, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you are in a chaotic environment, planning won't work, right? It's not about being smart. If it's chaotic, if there is an agent or a circumstance that can just change the way the world works at the drop of a hat, and you are vulnerable to that, you can do all the planning you like, but it will be wasted because it could go down the tubes. And this is where resources come in, because if we are very well resourced, we can buffer against that kind of uncertainty. Are people feeling like the world's a little bit uncertain at the moment? Are people shoring up their resources to cope with uncertainty? Because I am, right? And so what that means is I become more internal focused and less out there focused. So that same thing works in all of us. So what I want to say here is that both of these brains are normal. Neither of these brains is sick. One might have had, I'd rather grow up in this environment than this environment, but that doesn't make one of them better than the other, right? Just makes there a preference. One of them isn't bad and the other good either. Thank you. All right. And this is something that I call neuroecological diversity, the differences between people's biological, psychological and behavioural responses that have arisen as a consequence of their brains and physiologies having developed in diverse ecologies of development. So we've had the neurodiversity movement, which challenges how readily difference is pathologized, and that has called for an appreciation of difference. And I'm making a very parallel point here. So we wouldn't say these trees are attention-seeking. We wouldn't say these are narcissistically disordered. We wouldn't say these are OCD with perfectionist traits, or that these have body dysmorphic disorder, or that this tree has a problem with hoarding. It's perfectly clear to us that these are impacts of the environment. So what I encourage you to think about is thinking of, we have neuroplastic brains, that's how they work. The raindrops of experiences shape us. And this is quite a powerful idea. If experiences shape brains, well, what does that bring us? Well, it gives us a place where we can start being compassionate towards the experiences we had in our past. We didn't choose them. None of us chose those experiences. They were what they were. There's nothing we can do about them now, except maybe tell a different story about them. But it also gives us hope for the future, because we can put ourselves out in a different rainstorm. And for the clinicians here, you can be part of that rainstorm. You can be those raindrops that make a difference for another person. It gives us hope for our future, that we can change. And also it has this idea of changing the intensity and speed at which things happen. So I've probably... Thank you. I've probably changed the rate at which I sort of do things. So this paper was the first thing that put me onto this, Borderline Personality Disorder, Why Fast and Furious. It's an introduction to life history theory. So lastly then, I want to talk about this validation. I read this in a Thomas Ogden book. You must have struggled desperately to be a child your mother could despise and torment, because you must have been afraid that if you weren't, you would cease to have existed for her at all. And that speaks to that idea of me feeling like a ghost and feeling unstable. This isn't about my mum, but this is something about how we have to exist in someone else's mind to survive. So I encourage you maybe to try and be like the sun. You know how the sun reaches every part of us and warms us? And it means we can open up to it. If we can look at people like the sun looks at us, then it gives people a chance to open up and be more of themselves. I don't have time to go through all of these now, but if you want to just take a photo of this one, some of these are the things that I say to myself, and some of these are messages that I like hearing from others. My chemistry teacher had a parents' evening once with my mum, and he said to me the next day, he said, Haley, I knew you were having problems at home, and he said, to be honest, I didn't want to get involved. And I firstly valued his honesty. And then secondly, he said, but I met your mum, he said, and I just want to say well done. She struggled too, but she didn't have psychotherapy that I did. She didn't have the help that was available like I did. She didn't have the opportunities I have had to interrupt it. So here we are. How do we respond to shame with empathy and compassion? I don't think there's a magic thing to say. I think there might be a magic way to be, and I'm sure that many of you do it. I don't want to be teaching you to suck eggs. I will say that arguing with feelings or rationalizing feelings is wasted. It doesn't speak to the right part. I'm very smart and very rational a lot of the time, and I still get hijacked by my emotions. I just mostly need someone to hear them, and then they pass. They're like on stage for a bit, and then they go away. But if I try to get them off stage when they haven't had their say, they fight with me, and they'll fight with you. All right. So I thought I was lining up for 45, but I think I'm out of time. Thank you, everyone. Please. Thank you. I think one of those QR codes is for the paper, and I think the other one, goes to my page at the Centre for Mental Health Nursing. Please check them out, and please get in contact. Thank you.